The dry winds of the savanna whispered through the tall grass, carrying with them an unusual sound, a faint, broken cry. Hidden among the coarse leaves and branches, Scout, a full-grown lion with a scarred face and deep amber eyes, lifted his head, keen ears twitching to the fragile, unfamiliar noise. Scout was the king of this stretch of reserve, a seasoned male who had won his territory through hard-won battles and patience. But today, the sound drew him in, a call that didn't belong to his world of roars, growls, and rustling herds. A few hundred yards away, a young boy sat alone on the dirt road that wound through the vast reserve. His small frame was hunched, shoulders shaking as he wept, his cries barely rising above the wind. Dust clung to his tear-streaked cheeks, and his clothes were worn and tattered, his shoes scuffed from wandering alone. His name was David, though he was too young to understand the significance of a name left behind. Scout moved closer, his massive paws silent on the ground as he circled in, watching the boy from behind the cover of a nearby bush. At first, he hesitated, instinct and curiosity warring within him. Then, stepping out of the shadows, Scout let out a low, rumbling roar, a sound that rippled through the air like thunder. David froze, his cries catching in his throat as he turned to see the enormous lion standing only a few meters away. The boy's small heart raced, eyes wide with fear as Scout's powerful, watchful eyes met his. But something unusual flickered in Scout's gaze, a cautiousness, almost a hesitation. The boy looked helpless and afraid, nothing like the prey he knew. Scout remained still, watching. A distant memory surfaced in his mind, one of warmth, gentle hands, and a human face that had once been dear to him. Years ago, when Scout was just a cub, he had faced his first brush with loss and abandonment. His mother, a fierce and protective lioness, had been killed by poachers who left him vulnerable and alone, crying out in the same way David was now. Scout had been found and rescued by Ethan, a park ranger with a steady gaze and a strong heart. Ethan had heard Scout's cries echoing through the brush and, finding the tiny, terrified cub beside his mother's lifeless body, had reached out with the same protective instincts he showed for all creatures in the reserve. Ethan had raised Scout with care, nursing him to health and strength. Though Scout was wild at heart, Ethan had given him shelter, teaching him the ways of survival while helping him understand the boundaries between humans and the wild. Over time, Scout grew into a young lion, fierce and independent, yet carrying an unusual bond with Ethan. But knowing Scout was a creature of the savanna, Ethan knew he couldn't keep him by his side forever. When the time came, he carefully reintroduced Scout to the pride, watching from afar as the lion found his place among his kind, learning the ways of dominance and survival. For Ethan, this separation had been bittersweet, but he trusted that Scout would flourish, guided by the strength Ethan had seen in him since he was a cub. Now, as Scout faced the frightened boy on the road, that memory of Ethan's face softened something within him. He didn't feel the typical surge of dominance or hunger. Instead, a powerful sense of caution took hold. Scout took a step closer, his gaze steady, assessing the boy. David, trembling but unable to look away, watched Scout's every movement. He knew lions were dangerous, but he saw something different in this lion's eyes, an intelligence, a gentleness that he hadn't expected. Scout paused, sitting down on his haunches, lowering himself slightly to avoid looming over the child. He didn't growl or roar, he simply observed, his instincts and curiosity piqued by this strange, crying human. Though his instincts warned him to keep his guard up, something stirred deep within his chest, a memory of being saved, of being a frightened creature who had once needed help. In the distance, the sun began to dip lower, casting an orange hue over the savanna, illuminating the scene with a surreal, golden glow. The two beings sat together in silence, a boy and a lion connected by a thin thread of fate, each hesitant yet unwilling to part from the other. As dusk deepened, a gentle breeze swept across the savanna, ruffling Scout's thick mane. He remained near David, his amber eyes glinting in the fading light. The boy, too exhausted to cry anymore, simply sat, gazing in a mix of awe and fear at the lion who had yet to harm him. Scout circled slowly around David, his every movement calm, his large frame casting a protective shadow over the small boy. Despite their differences, there was an odd peace between them, a bond forged in silence. But Scout's calm was short-lived. A new scent drifted through the evening air, pricking Scout's senses. His ears perked up, and his eyes narrowed as he lifted his nose, sniffing cautiously. Another lion was nearby, and it wasn't from his pride. Scout's mane bristled as he stood taller, a low growl rumbling from his chest. He knew this scent. It belonged to a rogue male that had been stalking the edges of his territory, a lion hungry for dominance and territory. David sensed the change immediately, feeling a shiver run down his spine. Scout's calm demeanor had shifted into something tense and alert. As the rogue lion's presence grew closer, Scout placed himself between David and the unseen threat, his muscles taut and ready. He looked back at David with a fierce protectiveness in his gaze, as if silently urging the boy to stay still. Then, emerging from the shadows of the grassland, the rogue lion appeared, a large, battle-scarred male with a wild gleam in his eyes. He eyed Scout and the boy, his gaze flicking between them with a predatory interest. To this rogue, Scout's unusual behavior seemed weak, and the boy appeared to be an easy target. The rogue lion growled, baring his teeth in a clear challenge to Scout, who responded with an equally fierce roar. The two lions began circling each other, the tension in the air thick enough to feel. David's heart pounded as he watched the two massive creatures face off, frozen in a mix of fear and awe. He couldn't understand the details of what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain: Scout was protecting him. Scout lunged forward, his claws slashing through the air as he collided with the rogue. The savanna echoed with the sound of snarling and growling, dust flying up as the two lions battled for dominance. They clawed and bit, each one determined to prove himself the stronger. Despite the rogue's fierce attacks, Scout fought with a ferocity that came from somewhere deeper, a fierce instinct not only to defend his territory but also to protect the helpless child. The rogue lion roared in anger, trying to break through Scout's defenses, but Scout stood his ground, using every bit of his strength to keep the other lion at bay. Each time the rogue tried to circle toward David, Scout would position himself between them, refusing to let the threat pass. The rogue's strength began to wane as he realized Scout's determination was greater than he had anticipated. With a final frustrated roar, the rogue broke away, retreating back into the tall grass, his pride wounded. Panting and exhausted, Scout watched until the rogue's shadow disappeared completely, ensuring that the threat was gone. Only then did he turn back to David, his body still tense but his gaze softening. The boy, though shaken, looked up at Scout with an unspoken gratitude. Somehow, despite not understanding the lion's language or actions, David knew that Scout had protected him. As Scout continued to guard David, the noise of the lion's fight had reached the ears of someone very familiar with the sound of his roar: Ethan, the park ranger. He was doing his final rounds for the evening when he heard the unmistakable growls and rushed toward the noise, instinctively knowing it involved Scout. Ethan hurried through the reserve, his flashlight swinging wildly as he searched for the source of the sound. Finally, he reached the dirt road and stopped in shock at the sight before him. There, surrounded by the twilight shadows, was a young boy sitting beside Scout, who lay protectively near him. The scene seemed surreal: a child, alone in the middle of the reserve, with a wild lion at his side, and neither was trying to harm the other. Ethan approached slowly, his heart pounding, his mind racing to make sense of the sight. He spoke softly, keeping his voice calm as he moved closer. "Hey there," he called out to the boy, "it's all right. I'm here to help." David looked up, his eyes widening as he saw Ethan approaching, a figure of safety and familiarity after so much fear and confusion. Scout, recognizing Ethan, didn't move to threaten him but instead lay down, watching his human friend approach with trust. Ethan knelt down in front of David, reaching out gently to comfort the boy. "It's okay," Ethan said, his voice soothing. "You're safe now." As he placed a reassuring hand on David's shoulder, Ethan's mind flooded with questions. How had this child ended up here in the reserve? And more astonishingly, why had Scout, a lion known for his fierce independence, protected him so fiercely? Yet Ethan didn't press the boy with questions, he could see the exhaustion in David's eyes. His priority was getting the child to safety. Carefully, Ethan lifted David into his arms, glancing back at Scout, who remained lying down, watching the two of them with a calm yet attentive gaze. As Ethan walked away, David rested his head on the ranger's shoulder, glancing back at the lion who had protected him. Though he couldn't put it into words, David felt a deep, unspoken bond with Scout, a strange kinship that transcended fear and understanding. Before disappearing into the darkness of the reserve, Ethan looked back one last time at Scout, who gave a low, rumbling growl, almost as if in farewell. Ethan nodded slightly, an unspoken gesture of gratitude for the lion who had once again shown a heart of courage and loyalty, even after so many years apart. Scout's silhouette faded into the night, his presence still lingering in Ethan's thoughts as he carried David back to safety. With every step Ethan took toward the ranger station, the pieces of the puzzle began to form in his mind. Something, or someone, had led David to this reserve, placing him in the path of a lion who, against all odds, had chosen to protect him. The truth of this mystery was still hidden, waiting to be uncovered, but tonight, one thing was certain: the savannah had brought Scout and David together in an encounter that would change their lives forever. Back at the ranger station, Ethan gently set David down on a bench, draping a blanket around his small shoulders. David, still dazed, looked around the modest room, his wide eyes taking in every detail. He held onto the blanket tightly, as if clinging to a sense of safety that had been long absent. Ethan, crouching to the boy's eye level, offered him a warm smile, trying to calm the young child who seemed so lost. "David, right?" he asked softly, having heard the boy mutter his name on the way back. David nodded, his gaze never fully meeting Ethan's, still guarded and uncertain. The park ranger could tell that the child's journey to this point had not been easy. He was struck by a single, burning question: why had David been left in the heart of the reserve? Ethan decided to give the boy a moment before pressing with questions. Instead, he walked over to a small desk in the corner, reviewing the camera footage from the previous day, hoping for some clue as to how David had ended up alone in the wilderness. He watched as the footage rolled, scanning every second with sharp, focused eyes. Then, he saw her. The camera captured a woman, likely in her mid-30s, dressed simply, with a look of quiet desperation in her eyes. She was clutching David's hand, leading him to the very edge of the reserve. Ethan's breath caught as he watched her kneel down, cupping David's face with a tenderness that seemed incongruous with the act she was about to commit. Her expression was full of sorrow as she brushed a hand over his cheek, whispering something to the boy before pulling him into a final hug. In a haunting, silent goodbye, the woman kissed David's forehead, lingering for a brief moment before standing up, tears in her eyes. She glanced over her shoulder, her face etched with guilt and fear, and then she walked away, leaving David standing alone, staring after her retreating form until she was out of sight. Ethan closed his eyes, feeling a wave of sympathy and confusion. Why would a mother leave her child alone in such a dangerous place? Had she been forced into this choice, or was she running from something even more threatening? As Ethan considered the woman's possible reasons, David shifted uncomfortably on the bench, his eyes distant as if he too were reliving the painful memory. It was a mystery with no easy answers, but Ethan's resolve grew stronger. He would do everything he could to understand this boy's past and find a way to keep him safe. The night wore on, and Ethan did his best to make David comfortable. Over time, David began to relax, especially once Ethan started sharing gentle, reassuring stories about the reserve and its many creatures. He told David about the rhinos, the clever meerkats, and the vast herds of zebras that roamed under the African sun. But the story that made David's eyes light up was the one about Scout. Ethan explained how he had found Scout as a helpless cub and raised him until he was strong enough to return to the wild. He spoke of Scout's courage, his intelligence, and his instinct to protect those he cared about. "Scout saved you today, didn't he?" Ethan asked, watching as David's face softened at the memory of the lion who had stood guard over him. David nodded slowly, a faint smile playing at the corners of his lips. "Was he, your friend?" David asked timidly, his voice barely a whisper. Ethan chuckled softly, nodding. "Yes, in a way. Scout's a wild animal, but sometimes, there's a bond that goes beyond words or rules. I think he saw something in you that reminded him of himself." David seemed to ponder this, his young mind trying to make sense of a world in which even the wildest creatures could show kindness. He no longer felt afraid but rather fascinated by the idea of a lion who could be both fierce and gentle. Scout, in his mind, was no longer a creature of fear but one of strength and loyalty. Over the next few days, Ethan contacted local authorities to learn more about David's situation. No relatives had come forward, and there was no record of a missing child named David in the surrounding areas. It was as if he had simply appeared, left in the wilderness by a woman who had disappeared just as mysteriously. In the meantime, David's attachment to Ethan grew, and the feeling was mutual. Ethan had always felt a protective instinct, but David awakened something deeper within him, a paternal desire to shield and care for him. Every evening, after their long days of exploring the reserve, they would sit together, with David asking endless questions about the animals and the land. Ethan patiently answered, finding solace in the child's presence as much as David did in his. But a question lingered between them, one that neither spoke out loud but both felt: would David stay with Ethan forever, or was he destined to return to an uncertain life elsewhere? Eventually, Ethan was faced with a decision. The authorities wanted to place David in an orphanage, a move that Ethan couldn't bear to accept. He saw the fear in David's eyes when the idea was mentioned, the way he clung to Ethan's arm, seeking reassurance. Ethan knew that sending David away would be like tearing apart the fragile sense of belonging that had finally formed in the boy's life. After a long, sleepless night, Ethan made up his mind. He would adopt David, giving him the family he deserved. The decision felt right, like the pieces of their shared fate had finally aligned. He couldn't change the past for David, but he could offer him a future, one where he would be safe, loved, and surrounded by the beauty of the reserve. Ethan met with the officials the next day, laying out his case with quiet determination. He had the stability, the resources, and most importantly, the heart to raise David. The process would be lengthy and filled with challenges, but Ethan was prepared to face it all for the sake of the boy who had come into his life in the most unexpected of ways. As the final decision was pending, Ethan brought David to the edge of the reserve one last time to see Scout. They stood on the hill, the wide expanse of the savanna stretching before them. Scout was in the distance, his proud form silhouetted against the setting sun. He lifted his head and let out a deep, resonant roar, a sound that echoed through the land, fierce yet full of something almost reverent. David looked up at Ethan, his eyes shining with admiration and love. "Do you think Scout knows?" Ethan nodded, his own eyes misting over. I think he does, David. I think he knew all along. They stood there, father and son, watching Scout in silent gratitude for the lion who had brought them together, binding them with a bond that transcended the boundaries of species, circumstance, and fate. Several months had passed since that unforgettable evening, and the reserve felt different in subtle ways. David was no longer the lost, frightened child left on the edge of the savannah. Under Ethan's care, he had blossomed into a bright, curious boy, his eyes full of wonder and confidence. The adoption process, though arduous, had finally been completed, and Ethan was now officially David's father. For David, the reserve had become home, a sanctuary that held both safety and adventure, where he felt a deep, unbreakable connection to the land, the animals, and above all, to Ethan. Today, as a celebration of their new life together, Ethan planned to take David on a special trip across the reserve, an expedition that would introduce him more fully to the world he had only glimpsed before. David couldn't contain his excitement, barely able to sit still as they climbed into Ethan's open Jeep. The sun was just rising, casting a warm golden glow over the endless grasslands, the colors vivid and alive. Today's a big day, Ethan said, grinning as he started the engine. We're going to see some of the reserve's secrets. Are you ready, partner? David's face lit up as he nodded eagerly, his smile wide and uncontainable. I'm ready. The Jeep bumped along the dirt path, each turn revealing new wonders. They passed a herd of zebras, their striped coats shimmering in the morning light, and a cluster of curious meerkats popping up from their burrows, watching the Jeep pass with bright, beady eyes. Ethan pointed out each species, explaining their habits and quirks, while David listened intently, his eyes wide with fascination. Every now and then, he'd reach over and squeeze Ethan's hand, a small gesture that spoke volumes about the trust and bond they shared. As they traveled deeper into the reserve, Ethan drove toward a secluded area where Scout's pride often roamed. He hadn't seen Scout since that fateful night, but he had heard reports from other rangers about the lion's movements, always keeping track of him in the quiet hope of another encounter. Suddenly, as they rounded a bend, Ethan spotted a familiar form lounging in the shade of a large acacia tree. There was no mistaking the proud stance, the thick, majestic mane, or the calm, watchful eyes. It was Scout. The lion lifted his head, his amber gaze fixed on the Jeep with a steady, knowing look. David's eyes widened with recognition and excitement. It's him. It's Scout. Ethan slowed the Jeep to a stop, watching Scout from a respectful distance. He glanced at David, whose face was filled with awe. He remembers you, David. Lions don't usually do this, but Scout, well, he's special. With a gentle nudge, Ethan gestured for David to stand up in the Jeep, giving him a better view of Scout. The boy stood tall, one hand resting on Ethan's shoulder as he gazed at the lion who had once saved him. There was a deep understanding in Scout's eyes, a quiet acknowledgement of the moment that had bound them together. They stared at each other for a long time, boy and lion, their connection as undeniable as it was extraordinary. As if sensing the importance of this moment, Scout gave a soft growl, a sound not of warning, but of recognition. It was a greeting, perhaps even a blessing from the lion who had once been Ethan's ward and who had, in turn, protected his new family. David waved, a small, sincere gesture that seemed to say everything he couldn't put into words. Then, with one final, dignified look, Scout turned and padded away, disappearing into the tall grass. David watched until Scout was completely gone, feeling a sense of both closure and gratitude. He was saying goodbye, wasn't he? David whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Ethan nodded, his own throat tight with pride and affection. Yes, I think he was. He knows you're safe now. As they continued their journey, Ethan shared stories from his years on the reserve, of close encounters, of loss and resilience, and of the fierce beauty of nature. He told David about the times he'd faced poachers, the challenges of protecting animals, and the difficult choices that came with his role. But he also spoke of the joy in watching creatures thrive, the satisfaction of knowing he was making a difference. David listened intently, absorbing every word. He asked questions about the animals and their lives, about the dangers they faced and the ways Ethan and the other rangers kept them safe. In these conversations, Ethan could see the beginning of something deeper within David, a growing understanding of the importance of protecting the wild, of respecting the delicate balance of life in the reserve. And Ethan, in turn, felt a profound sense of pride. He had not only gained a son but had found a companion who shared his love for the land, a child who had a natural connection to the world around him. He realized that David wasn't just his son, he was his legacy, someone who would carry forward the lessons and values Ethan held dear. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, Ethan and David returned to the ranger station, their hearts full and minds brimming with memories of the day. The reserve, once a place of solitude for Ethan, was now a home in every sense of the word, filled with the laughter and wonder of a child who had once been a stranger and was now family. That night, as they sat together by the fire, David looked up at Ethan, his face thoughtful. "Dad," he began softly, the word feeling both new and natural, "can I be a ranger like you one day?" Ethan's heart swelled, and he pulled David close, resting his chin on his son's head. "Yes, David. I think you already are." They stayed like that, a father and son bound not by blood but by shared experiences, trust, and love. In that quiet moment, the weight of their journey settled, and both of them understood that they had found something rare and beautiful, a sense of belonging that neither had anticipated, a family forged from compassion, courage, and an unlikely savanna encounter. Years passed, and David grew up under Ethan's watchful guidance. He learned the skills of a ranger, the value of conservation, and the delicate art of respecting the land and its creatures. He carried with him the memory of Scout, a lion who had taught him that strength could be gentle, that courage could be quiet, and that bonds could be formed across the boundaries of species and circumstance. As David eventually took on the role of a ranger, the reserve flourished under his care, his reputation as a compassionate protector of the land following him. And whenever he needed guidance or felt the weight of responsibility, he would visit the acacia tree where he had last seen Scout, standing quietly and remembering the lion who had once been his guardian. In every roar that echoed across the reserve, in every sunset that painted the savanna, and in every new life that thrived under his watch, David carried forward the legacy of Ethan, Scout, and the bond they had shared. And somewhere, in the heart of the reserve, Scout's spirit roamed, ever watchful, forever a part of the family he had helped to create.